Now entering the elevator to the retail underground. Enjoy the descent to the subversive layer of knowledge.
Does everyone remember Blockbuster? No, not that sad shell of a company that there is today, if you can even really call it that. I'm talking about the powerhouse video rental store from the 80s, 90s, and early 2000s. They were literally everywhere, and the place to be after school on a Friday night. Some of my fondest childhood memories were going to video rental stores and picking out the perfect movie or game for the weekend. My parents oftentimes would let my brothers and I go pick out that perfect movie that we wanted while they went and picked out something for them to watch. And by far, our favorite video rental store of all was Blockbuster. Sure, there was high-level competitors like Family Video and Hollywood Video. Or, you know what, you could go and purchase the movie for an insanely high price at your local Walmart or Target if you wanted to. But in reality, nothing ever seemed to compare to Blockbuster. They just had that it factor. I mean, come on. They had what seemed like an endless amount of movies and games you could rent for super cheap. And the smell. Oh, the smell. The smell that you could never forget. The smell of fresh vinyl from DVD and movie covers. The sight of all the newest releases lining the outer walls of the store. Spending hours, maybe that was just me, who knows, but spending hours searching for the perfect movie. Life was good. Guys, I'm not going to lie. The nostalgia with this one is real. I loved Blockbuster. I wish they were still around. There's a big part of me that wishes that things were the way that they used to be, and Blockbuster was still here bigger than ever. Now, don't get me wrong. I love Netflix and all the other streaming services that are out there and available. They're convenient, inexpensive, and really, for the most part, efficient. Real game changer, to be honest. But still, there's a big part of me that can't help but feel for the younger generation that they won't get a chance to experience that feeling of being a kid in a movie rental store. I mean, simpler times, and life was much simpler. But anyway, enough of that. What I really want to dive into here is what happened to Blockbuster. How did this massive company that seemed to have a corner on the market really kind of fade away into obscurity so quickly? To get the answer, I think we need to start from the beginning and work our way forward. Blockbuster started out in 1985. The company grew very, very quickly. Many families were starting to purchase their very first VCRs. Remember those things? Man, how the times have changed. I don't even know if there's VCRs even being sold or exist anymore. They're kind of a relic at this point. Anyway, by the early 90s, Blockbuster was basically the standard in home movie rentals. Business model was pretty straightforward, and for the time, it was a solid business model. Basically, the company would purchase a bunch of VHS tapes, again, VHSs. Who remembers those things, right? And years later, DVDs, another relic. Rent them out until they recoup and exceed their original investment. Once the movie becomes outdated or unprofitable due to it not being rented much and taking away valuable shelf space from the new and more popular movies, you sell it for cheap to your customers. They were able to copy that idea with video games as well. Business was good. It was very good. Now, the rental business wasn't the only revenue the Blockbuster stores were generating, but it was by far their largest. Depending on the year that you look at it, typically the rentals would account for 70 to 80% of their store sales, with merchandise, snacks, other miscellaneous income making up the rest. So we've established that Blockbuster grew fast and furious, and overall for the time period had what would appear to be a solid business model in their favor. So what happened? What turned this juggernaut of a company into a cautionary tale for so many other businesses? Well, the easy answer that most are going to say is Netflix. And it does appear Netflix was one of the main driving forces in Blockbuster's demise. I don't think it's necessarily that simple. You see, Netflix wasn't always the juggernaut that it's known as today. Many won't remember this. Heck, I barely remember this. I was pretty young at the time. But Netflix actually started out as a direct-to-consumer movie rental business. Basically, the customer would go to the Netflix website, pick out what movies they wanted, and then have them physically mailed to them. Yes, physically mailed, like snail mail, in the mailbox to them. Once they were done, the customer would simply send them back into Netflix. I know, that sounds tedious, right? Well, in today's world it is. However, in the early days of Netflix, this was revolutionary. Okay, nobody had done this before. This was huge. For the first time, you didn't have to go and get the movie. The movie came to you. You just pick out simply what you want and then wait for it, okay? So one other major upside Netflix enjoyed compared to Blockbuster was their pricing model. Whereas Blockbuster offered a per movie rental charge, which individually was pretty cheap, but honestly, it could get fairly costly if you were renting a bunch of movies for the whole family. Netflix offered a straightforward monthly subscription fee with unlimited access to all their movies. Unlimited. You could get as many as you wanted to. It was awesome. Another pricing difference was the late fees. And yes, the good old late fees. Man, people hated these things. Basically, Blockbuster knew in order to maximize profits, they needed the movies returned to them in a timely manner. So to ensure that they were going to get them back on time, they would only let you rent the movie for a set amount of time. If the movie was returned within that time, everything was good. However, if you returned it late, you were subject to pay a late fee penalty. Now, this might not seem like a huge deal on paper, and as you're listening to it, it might be like, okay, what's the big deal? But late fees actually made up a huge portion of revenue for Blockbuster. Remember earlier we were talking about how 70 to 80% of store sales, depending on the year, typically was from generated from the rental business? Well, a big portion of that was the late fees that made that up. So as Blockbuster started to see the issues with their pricing and the consumer mindset was starting to shift to preferring subscription-based options and other models, Blockbuster knew that they needed to adapt. So they did. They decided to roll out a no late fee program, which in essence eliminated late fees and gave customers a grace period to return the movie. If it went past the grace period, they simply charged the customer the difference and had them keep the movie. Sounds kind of complicated, right? Well, it was, and it really wasn't well received. What Blockbuster ultimately expected to help and excite customers really became more of a confusion and a hindrance to their business. I also want to touch on one other huge difference between the two business models. Remember earlier we were talking about how you could go into a Blockbuster and spend hours picking out that perfect movie for the night and how awesome it could be? Well, it was also one of their fatal flaws. I mean, think about it. Nowadays, we can just stop streaming something right in the middle of it, or really in the first 5 or 10 minutes if you want to. If you don't like it, you just stop streaming it and you go to something else. Or even back in the day when Netflix first started, you could get as many DVDs as you wanted to because it was an unlimited subscription. So there was no pressure to spend tons of time searching for that perfect flick for the weekend. You know what? You might as well just get 5 movies instead of 2. Then, you know what? If you don't like the other 2, you got 3 more, That was really the biggest benefit to that. So now that we've established that Netflix was in fact a big part of the fall of Blockbuster with the two differing business models, as many of you probably guessed, I want to step back for a second and talk about the other main issue. Blockbuster themselves, okay? A lot of this falls on them. They have nobody to blame but themselves, and it's understandable what happened, but I think we have to go back to looking at the company as a whole and realizing that really they were their own worst enemy through part of this. You see, after Netflix was founded in 1997, they grew quickly, very similar to Blockbuster's story. Very, very quick growth. So much so, in fact, that in the year 2000, Blockbuster actually had the chance to purchase Netflix for $50 million. That's right. Netflix, the multi-billion-dollar business that we know and love today, was actually for sale in the year 2000, some 20 plus years ago, for only $50 million. And Blockbuster had the inside track on that deal if they wanted it. However, in probably their single worst move, they turned down the deal and preferred to remain competitors with Netflix. Now, I know a ton of you are probably sitting there right now and thinking, that's literally the dumbest move in the history of business. And at first thought, you'd be right. I thought so too. But, and there's always a but, after digging a bit deeper, it doesn't seem like the worst idea for them at the time. Now, again, we're looking at this from a timestamp of 2000 rather than 2021, which it is now. First of all, it would have been impossible for them to see the future of Netflix and what they would become a little over 20 years later. Secondly, at the time, Blockbuster was still completely dominating the movie rental market. I mean, they really were. And they did so for another 4 to 5 years, roughly, till about 2004. Even after turning away this deal. So again, at the time, they seemed like they had the upper hand in the competition, and it really made more sense to invest their capital into furthering their own business endeavors. And finally, at the same time this offer was on the table, Blockbuster had just entered into a partnership with Enron and was experimenting with a new version of fiber optic streaming. Unfortunately for them, Enron, as we all know, went belly up, and the technology really just didn't pan out. Even in 2001, so 1 year later, they tried to partner up with DirecTV and enter into video streaming. However, that ended up being shortly lived. A little bit later on, they tried launching their own full-blown streaming service called Blockbuster All Access. Initially, it actually was a big success and very popular. However, after they gained a lot of initial subscribers, many customers started to dwindle down as the pricing for Blockbuster streaming was more than Netflix and other competitors. Heck, Blockbuster even tried to compete head-to-head with Redbox. They rolled out their own rental kiosk called Blockbuster Express, which eventually ended up in the hands of Redbox. So they really did try to at least compete in all these different facets of the business. Looking back on it, the best move for Blockbuster would have been to take that deal with Netflix, not only because we can look at it 20 years later and see what Netflix ultimately becomes, but also these other ventures actually, I would say, cost the company more money than just buying Netflix outright for $50 million. Funnily enough, what they were working on with their streaming services really is somewhat similar to what Netflix and all these other competitors would turn their business models into in another 5 to 10 years and would ultimately lead to their ascent and Blockbuster's demise. So let's recap. Blockbuster grew very quickly into the #1 movie rental business that there was. However, as other technologies quickly changed, big competitors started to flood the market. Blockbuster didn't change with the times fast enough. Although they did make efforts to change their model to a more digitalized business, they never really went all in on that concept, instead opting to open more brick-and-mortar stores and dabble a little bit with the streaming models to see what version of it was the most profitable. The toughest thing for them in changing would have been what to do with all the overhead that they had accumulated. Think about it for a second. You literally have thousands of storefronts with thousands upon thousands of movies at each storefront. That'd be a nightmare to maneuver in and out of and go fully into the streaming business. So it's understandable that they were hesitant to do a full-on change. Basically, what was once their biggest strength, their business model, rapidly became their biggest weakness, seemingly overnight. At least that's the way I see it. Guys, let us know in the comments below what your thoughts are on Blockbuster and ultimately what happened. Do you miss Blockbuster? Are you glad that things have kind of played out the way that they have? There's part of me that, again, loves, I love all these streaming services. I love the convenience of it, but there's a huge part of me that still wishes I could go back to, a 10-year-old Kyle and be able to walk into a Blockbuster again. So don't forget to subscribe, guys, to the channel. We greatly appreciate it. Have a great rest of your day. We'll catch you in the next one.